Hello and welcome to week 5 of Baptist History and Distinctives. And again, I'd like to give you an overview of what I want you to focus in on this week. Again, refer to your weekly folder for the slides that you're supposed to study for this week's study. And as you get into week 5, I want you to be aware of Baptist leaders in colonial America that helped establish and grow the Baptist Church and their role in religious liberty in America. Men like Isaac Backus, who was one of the most important Baptist leaders here in colonial America during the 18th century. He established the Baptist Church at Middleborough, Massachusetts, which interestingly started out as a congregational church. He was saved as during the Great Awakening, and they established a congregational church there in Middleborough. But as Backus studied the Scriptures, he became convinced of Baptist principles and established that church as a Baptist church. So be very aware of Isaac Backus and who he was. Backus also would become fundamental in the struggle for religious liberty here in America during the 18th century. He was one of the key leaders of the struggle for religious liberty in the United States there in that pre-revolutionary period. A key advocate of religious liberty and struggled for that all of his life and all of his ministry. So be aware of Isaac Backus. He also wrote the earliest Baptist history of Baptist here in America. Isaac Backus did, and be aware of that and be familiar with him. Be aware also of the growth of Baptists here in the South, in North Carolina and South Carolina and so forth. Be aware how that in colonial America there in the 18th century, Baptists formed basically two groups, became regular Baptist and became separate Baptist. And be aware of those two groups of Baptists here in colonial America and the distinctions between the two. Be able to define what was a regular Baptist, what was a separate Baptist, and be aware of those two movements. Be aware of, as I talked about Backus and his impact here in America, the rapid growth of Baptists across America, like in New England, the ministry of men like Hezekiah Smith, who was an influential pastor there in Massachusetts in the 18th century. Be aware of him and what he did and his influence. Be aware of the oldest Baptist university in America, Rhode Island Baptist College, which was established in Providence, which later became known as today as Brown University. And Brown University was founded as a Baptist institution back in the 18th century there in Rhode Island, and be aware of that and Baptist involvement in that. Also, want you to be aware of Baptist leaders like Walter Powers, Joshua Emery, Valentine Reitman, what they did. Be aware also of Morgan Edwards. Morgan Edwards was pastor of the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia for about 26 years, a number of years, and he wrote one of the first Baptist histories in America too. He wrote a book called 50 Years Among Baptists, which is still in print, which you can read today, which is considered a very important resource about early Baptist in America. So be aware of Morgan, his ministry. Another man I want you to be aware of too is the Reverend John Gano, who was a dear man of God who pastored the New York City Regular Baptist Church for over 25 years, and also became a chaplain during the American Revolution and ministered to people. He even traveled. He traveled. He did travels as an evangelist and traveled around the South here, doing some preaching and evangelism. He even came here to North Carolina and preached at Jersey Baptist Church right down in south of Lexington, North Carolina, right here close to Piedmont International University, and was a wonderful man of God, greatly used of God, a regular Baptist minister. And he also is reputed to have baptized George Washington upon profession of faith during the American Revolution. So I want you to read about that and be aware of that. I think you might find that interesting, that that's a little historical side note, that it's possible that George Washington could have been baptized by a Baptist minister during the American Revolution, and there's some evidence for that. So read about that. Also, I want you to be familiar with Thomas Killingsworth and his ministry, Baptist like Isaac Chandler, William Fry and others, Oliver Hart. Also be aware of Dr. Richard Furman, who is one of our key influential Baptist leaders here in the South and instrumental in helping eventually into the growth of the Southern establishment of the Southern Baptist Convention. Dr. Furman was a pastor of the First Baptist Church in Charleston, South Carolina. He also was very interested in education, promoted education, was involved in helping establish educational institutions, and eventually Furman University would be named after Dr. Furman, which is based in Greenville, South Carolina. So be aware of Dr. Richard Furman and his ministry here, how he was a key Baptist and how he helped organize the State Baptist Convention of South Carolina, and he helped organize the National Organization of Baptists in America in 1814. Be aware of Dr. Furman, and his influence. Another thing I want you to be aware of too is how that Baptists here in the South encounter persecution. You've studied about Baptist persecution in England, how that it occurred over there. But what you may not be aware of is Baptists suffered here prior to the American Revolution right here in colonial America, particularly in the state of Virginia. In the state of Virginia, the Church of England was established as a state church, and they dictated that if you worshiped in Virginia, you had to follow the practices of the Anglican Church and the Book of Common Prayer and the practices of the church. And you were to conform to the State Church of Virginia, which was the Anglican Church. Of course, Baptists, were independent of that, didn't agree with that. And as they practiced in pre-revolutionary Virginia, they ran into some suffering. So be aware of that and what happened, the difficulties that they encountered there. I want you to be familiar with Daniel Marshall, Shubal Stearns, how they established the separate Baptist movement in North Carolina, right here down the road from Piedmont International University, just outside of Ramseur, North Carolina, at the Sandy Creek Baptist Church. Shubal Stearns founded that in 1755, which became one of the mother churches of Baptist here in North Carolina and in the South. And Sandy Creek Baptist Church is considered the mother church of the State Baptist Convention of North Carolina, which is instrumental and part of the Southern Baptist Convention. So be aware of Stearns and his ministry, his brother-in-law, Daniel Marshall, and how he established historic Baptist churches here in North Carolina at Abbott's Creek, separate historic Baptist church in Virginia, another historic Baptist church, first separate Baptist church in Georgia, just outside of Augusta. Be aware of Daniel Marshall and his ministry and Shubal Stearns, those men, and what they did. So be familiar with that. And we talked about being aware of Sandy Creek Association and the evangelism that was done there. Be aware of what separate Baptists believed in contrast to regular Baptist. Be aware of those distinctions. That played a big part in churches here in North Carolina and Virginia. Also be aware of the associations that were formed, early Baptist associations here in colonial America, such as the Philadelphia Association. Be aware of that and the history behind that. The Charleston Baptist Association, Warren Association there in New England, which Isaac Backus helped form. Be aware of those associations, when they were founded, and who was involved in the formation of those societies. Also be familiar with Baptist life in early America. Be familiar with what Baptist churches practiced and some of their practices. I think you might find in your studies how interesting it is how that in some early Baptist churches there was ordination of women to offices such as eldress and deaconess. And so I think you might find that interesting there in your studies about early Baptists. How that they worshiped in simple buildings. They were usually small wooden churches. Be aware of that. There's church structure as far as elders and so forth. Be aware of that, how they were structured, how singing became an issue among early Baptists here in America. It's kind of interesting. We take for granted congregational singing here in our Baptist churches, but in the 18th century, it was an issue among Baptists. And Baptists actually disagreed, and there was even some split among Baptists over the issue of singing in the church. And should you sing in church? If you do, what kind of music should you sing? Very, very interesting background. and be aware how that the 18th century was a transformational time here in America. Be aware of the struggles for religious liberty here in America that we've talked about, how that Baptists suffered persecution. Be aware of some of the persecutions they endured, particularly in Virginia, like they had being forced to pay taxes to support the state church, fines, imprisonment, whippings, beatings, harassment, disruption of public Baptist services. Be aware of these things and be familiar with that. Be aware of how that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and John Leland, in particular, Baptist minister John Leland, who was a great evangelist, who was a champion advocate of religious liberty, how that he was key working with James Madison to establish freedom of religion in America. Baptists played a role in the Bill of Rights being established in the Constitution, particularly the First Amendment, which gives the freedom of religion in our country, which is a sacred principle here of our country and the founding of our country. Baptists played a role in that, particularly John Leland, and be aware of that and his involvement with James Madison, how that they established religious liberty here in our country. Isaac Backus, again, a key player in the struggle for religious liberty in America. We've mentioned him before. Be aware of him and his involvement in establishing religious liberty. And be aware of how this liberty was established through the American Revolution and so forth. Thank you very much.